through.
Yeah, we see there, as we said before, VanMeter on Jund monsters. Remember the Jund kind of monster aspect of the monsters deck, kind of an adaptation from used to be red-green monsters, splashing for cards like Abrupt Decay, which are very helpful in this matchup.
Yeah, Abrupt Decay is very good against Detention Sphere and Banishing Light, of course, and those cards are very good against Planeswalkers, so that's going to be a huge part of the way the game's play is that back and forth.
Yeah, Gerard kind of playing, I would say, a previous level Esper control deck, has embraced very few cards from Journey into Nyx in this list. I don't believe he actually has a Journey into Nyx card in his main deck.
It does not appear, yeah, he has no copies of anything new.
Yeah, so no Banishing Lights, which, you know, it's kind of, the fact that he's on the previous level actually ends up being very good in this matchup. You know, Chris is on the level where he's outsmarting the Banishing Lights and Detention Spheres by playing Abrupt Decays, but then you go back, Gerard only has the Detention Spheres.
Yeah. It's interesting, you know, a lot of people are just playing the Banishing Lights just because, yeah, Detention Sphere is great, and this is Detention Spheres 5 through 6, but in the Abrupt Decay heavy metagame, it's not clear if that's where you really want to be.
All right, well, Chris VanMeter, by virtue of being the number 5 seed, he gets to be on the play and starts off on a turn 1 Elvish Mystic, whereas Gerard has the typical turn 1 Temple start from control deck. So get to see, thanks to this acceleration and being on the play, what threats Chris can stick before the counter spell and control wall goes up.
And it's got to be Planeswalkers. You know, some of his creatures, Stormbreath Dragon, can be pretty powerful in the matchup, but Gerard's equipped with so many spot removal spells and so many sweepers that Chris is really going to need his Planeswalkers to come to bear here.
Yeah, he does have a Xenagos the Reveler in his hand. I do not believe he has Domri, but that should help. Gerard with a hand that's pretty well set up for the matchup, especially if Chris's game plan involves creatures. You see he has a copy of Azorius Charm to deal with an early creature. He has a Supreme Verdict, and he has a turn 6 Elspeth that he's setting up for.
Remember that deck lists are public in the elimination rounds, and there are no syncopates in Gerard's list. So Chris can just resolve the Xenagos next turn, even if Gerard plays an untapped land.
Yeah, it's a green light. There's no negate. There's no syncopate, and Gerard doesn't even have to represent it because of the deck lists. He puts his second land into play as another temple.
Yeah, now Gerard does have 3 copies of Thoughtseize in his main deck, but it doesn't appear that he has one of them right now.
Yeah. Interestingly enough, despite the fact that if you played in one of our premier event top 8s, despite the fact that deck lists are public, players cannot check them during the match. They have to do their homework ahead of time. So Chris, you know, he couldn't look at the board and say, wait, are there syncopates in this list? He'd have to know ahead of time.
But I'm sure that the first thing that he's looking for is what is Gerard's counterspell suite? Right. That's the most important thing.
But as you said, so the Xenagos the Reveler hits the turn on turn 3 for VanMeter. It makes a Satyr token, which will join his turn 2 Scavenging Ooze in the attack. Gerard goes down to 15 life, and already he's got some pressure on him.
Yeah, this is a great opening for Chris here. The turn 1 Mana Accelerant into a Planeswalker. That's the recipe he needs for this matchup.
Yeah, a third Temple from Fabiano scries as he leaves up Azorius Charm mana, and almost certainly will have Supreme Verdict's mana next turn as well.
Yeah. Gerard is making his land drops here. He's likely to be able to start casting his 4s, but right now he's falling way behind to the Xenagos.
Yeah, and this is really one of the things that Jund does. It forces the control deck to have a lot of answers, while at the same time, you know, so like still committing to the board. So Gerard, yeah, he can Azorius Charm here. Yeah, he can Verdict next turn. He can keep the board clean, but you know, Xenagos will still be in play.
Yeah, that's why the Detention Sphere into Supreme Verdict sequence is something that he needs.
Yeah, and a huge swing from VanMeter. He makes a second Satyr token, and this time Elvish Mystic joins the fray along with the 3 2/2s, knocking Gerard down to 8 life, and starting to get this very close to being a lethal attack next turn.
Yeah, Gerard's going to need Supreme Verdict essentially next turn to be able to keep his head above water, and even then, he's got some work to do because Xenagos isn't going anywhere.
Yeah, he'll go down to 6 after Supreme Verdicting. We see, rather than using Azorius Charm to bounce a creature, Gerard just draws a card off Azorius Charm.
He needs to find an answer to Xenagos, and if he's going to Supreme Verdict anyway, he'd rather just keep all the creatures in play.
Yeah, he does have a Supreme Verdict. I believe he drew a second Supreme Verdict for the turn. The question is whether or not he has the untapped land. The basic plains at the front of his hand seems to say yes to that question. And we see Supreme Verdict takes care of the creatures. Right now, Gerard is only on single blue mana, so cards like Dissolve and Jace and Sphinx's Revelation he does not have access to yet.
Although it's not necessarily about being able to cast the blue spells here because he's losing to the board.
Right, down to 6 from a Satyr token, and VanMeter keeps the pressure up again. This time he shocks for a Stomping Ground and puts Pelucranos World Eater into play. walk me through the shock there. He only had one green.
Yes.
All right, I was going to say, what can he cast off a Blood Crypt? But needing the mana. And so now we see, can Gerard stabilize? In his hand, the hiding out is a copy of Ultimate Price at the front there that can take care of Pelucranos, but this Xenagos is doing a lot of work. We see Gerard's down to 6.
Yeah, the thing is, Gerard does have an Elspeth Sun's Champion in his hand, so if he's able to deploy that, now all of a sudden he's got Xenagos mostly contained, and he can start leveraging his other resources.
Right, he still has to worry about cards like Storm Breath Dragon that would have haste on that turn when he taps out for Elspeth, presumably which he's going to do next turn.
Yeah, there's still some harrowing draws that Chris has access to, but Elspeth is a great start in getting this game stabilized.
Yeah. All right. And the 4th Satyr token for the game, this is the second one, joins the board. And we're going to have 2 Satyrs and Pelucranos looking to attack. You know Ultimate Price is going to take care of the Pelucranos. So question is if he can mitigate any more of the damage. And Price for the Hydra. And does he have Azorius Charm? Does he have anything else? Or is he going to 2? And it looks like it's down to 2.
Yeah, I think Gerard's plan here is to try to stabilize this game with Elspeth.
Another Pelucranos World Eater for Fabiano, and that actually means that Elspeth is no good here.
Correct, as Pelucranos can fight at least one token, and all Chris needs to do is connect with something.
Yeah, this is really kind of a clinic in how tempo can be very good against the Esper deck. Gerard really hasn't had a shortage of answers here. You know, he had his Azorius Charm, he had multiple Supreme, well, at least one Supreme Verdict, and he has spot removal. Had the option for a turn 4 Jace, has the option for a turn 6 Elspeth, but it looks like he may already be dead on this board.
Yep. And this is the power of the Planeswalker. Xenagos has done all the heavy lifting in this game. Every other card Chris has played has basically been incidental besides the Elvish Mystic accelerating into the Xenagos. It's just provided a steady stream of attackers and has allowed Chris to push his advantage without playing completely into Supreme Verdict.
Yeah, we see a Supreme Verdict in the front of Fabiano's hand. If he had an untapped land, he would need Supreme Verdict followed up by a card like Azorius Charm, but he doesn't have it, and game 1 goes to VanMeter.
Yeah, that was a great opening there for Chris, and that's exactly the recipe he needs in the matchup, just acceleration into a Planeswalker.
Yeah, so an interesting strategic choice there. For Fabiano, he had this choice of, I want to go back to that turn 2 Azorius Charm and talk about that play in a second. Before we get to that, though, we have to do a trivia question.
We do. So what's going to happen here, I'm going to ask you a trivia question. You're going to tweet that answer at SCG Live, hashtag SCG Premium. Of the correct responders, one will be selected at random for 6 free months of Start City Games Premium. It is about accuracy and not speed, so don't worry about submitting your answer first. Just make sure that it's accurate. And please note that this contest is run at the sole discretion of StarCityGames.com. Twitch.tv is in no way affiliated with this giveaway. And the question that I have for you is, Gerard is playing his own brew of Esper. It's different than a lot of the stock lists. He has 4 copies of Jace Architect of Thought, fairly common. 2 copies of Elspeth Sun's Champion, fairly common. Sometimes it's 3, sometimes it's 1, but we're still talking about some standard stuff. He has another Singleton Planeswalker. You rarely see this in Main's deck. Name that Planeswalker. Again, tweet your answer at SCG Live, hashtag SCG Premium, and one of you will be selected at random for 6 free months of Star City Games Premium content.
Remember, you can find access to the players' deck lists in the top 8 and from feature matches of this tournament at StarCityGames.com in our deck database. So let's go back to the match.
Yep.
Yeah, I thought one of the turns earlier, there was this pivotal play where Gerard had an Azorius Charm on turn 2. And this shows like just how delicate these control decks can be. We saw Gerard cycle an Azorius Charm in what I think was correct at the time. You know, he needed, he wanted to guarantee his land drops. He knew he was setting up for Supreme Verdict, so he felt like he had to cycle the Charm. It turned out he was unable to win because he didn't have another 2-mana removal spell on that last turn. And so there's this balancing act that he really has to strike of, you know, can he afford to use extra cards to get land drops, or does he really just have to luck into them, as it were?
Yeah, I think Gerard was at risk of missing a land drop in that game, which is why he cycled the Azorius Charm as early as he did.
Right.
But yeah, there is definitely something to be said for having patience with that card and using it as insurance policy in some spots if you can afford to. But the priority number 1 for Gerard is just hitting his land drops. If he stalls on land, he just dies. So that takes precedent over some additional utility of being able to hold on to an Azorius Charm.
Yeah, let's go ahead and looking at the sideboards. Gerard now down a game. A lot of his board cards for this matchup are in the main deck, as we said before. He does have his cards like 2 Doomblade, 2 Ultimate Price are in the main. His sideboard is actually pretty interesting here, as you normally see an Esper sideboard as a smattering of lots of different 2-mana instants, whereas while he has some of that, he has his Negates, his Glare of Heresy, a lot of his cards are actually proactive cards, as like Archangel Thune, Ashiok Nightmare Weaver, and Bramaz, King of Areskos.
Yeah, I think you're going to see the Archangels come in. They're pretty well suited for this matchup. I'm not sure if you're going to go all the way down to Bramaz, because Chris is really good at blocking on the ground. Bramaz lines up very poorly against cards like Palikronos, so I'm not sure that card's going to come in, but I think Archangel will. And he may want the Ashioks as well. I think he's going to bring in the Pithy Needle to answer Chris's Planeswalkers, and the Negates as well. Even though Chris isn't that spell heavy, a lot of his best cards are spells, most notably the Planeswalkers.
Yeah, Ashiok I actually really like in this matchup. I haven't had too much experience casting Ashiok out of a control deck. One thing I do remember when I first started playing the format and was playing monsters, I lost an important match to a blue-black control deck because his turn 3 Ashiok was very difficult for me to deal with. When the control deck was on the play, Ashiok hitting Palikronos is just a nightmare for Jund monsters. It goes up to 5, hits a 4-drop, it can make a Palikronos, still keep the Ashiok alive, and a 5/5 on defense is actually decently difficult for Jund to deal with, especially when it costs 4.
Yeah, and Ashiok just has a ton of loyalty. I mean, that's the big thing here. Combined with Gerard's ability to protect it with his Doomblades and Ultimate Prices and Sweepers and such, it could be a problematic card for Chris. And it's not even Gerard's primary angle of attack. It's just another supplemental thing he has going on. So that is a possible avenue that Gerard's going to want to go down here.
Right. The danger of the card would be that VanMeter can just ignore it. But
yes.
I think there are enough creatures in the Jund Monsters deck that Ashiok probably will have to be answered.
Yeah. Although he's already playing against a deck that's going to be keeping in Abrupt Decay against him. So it's not clear that he's really going to want to go too far down the Ashiok road, but it is a possible angle of attack that Gerard has access to. On Chris's side of the sideboard, there's 3 Mizkar Hydra, 3 Nylea's Disciple, 2 Putrefy, a Mizium Mortars, 2 Rakdos Return, 2 Golgari Charm, a Doomblade, and a Vraska. You're going to see the anti-control cards come in here. The 3 copies of Mizkar Hydra, the Vraska, the Unseen, 2 copies of Golgari Charm, and 2 copies of Rakdos Return. This is pretty standard stuff, just removing some of his inefficient creatures and creature removal spells. For example, he's got a Mizium Mortars in his main deck. Now, he still may want to keep in the 2 Dreadbores because Gerard, of course, has Planeswalkers, and the Abrupt Decays are good here as well. But he has some inefficient creatures. Cards like Gorklan Rampager, Palikronos, Corsair Krufix, not that good against control decks, and he gets to bring in a bunch of anti-control haymakers like Mizkar Hydra and the various spells.
Yeah, interestingly enough, we've seen Chris VanMeter sideboard for this matchup before in this tournament, and while you mentioned what to side in is pretty standard, it's the anti-control package. What VanMeter does interesting in this matchup is what he sides out. Yes, Mizium Mortars comes out, but he doesn't side out all the copies of any card. Talking with him, he shaves different cards in the matchup. Like the cards he might want to board out would be Caryatid, Gorklan Rampager, Palikronos. Some copies of all of them will still be in the deck.
He still needs to keep his threat density and mana acceleration density in a certain place, so he can't fully bail on any of those cards.
All right, and our game 2 underway here in the semifinals. Gerard Fabiano down a game, now in the play against Chris VanMeter. We see a tempo, the typical start for Fabiano, and we'll see whether or not Chris can get one of, that Elvish Mystic start last time. The fact that he was on the play and had Elvish Mystic just proved to be too much tempo for Fabiano to deal with.
Yeah, absolutely. On the other side of the bracket, Charlie Reinhardt up a game, and that's a big one for the black-white mid-range player, being able to steal game 1 against Esper Control. Yeah,
Lewis Calanta's playing Esper Control and really gets to capitalize on all the dead cards that black-white mid-range would have in game 1, but wasn't able to capitalize enough, and now Calanta's going to have to take both sideboarded games in the face of a sea of Duress and Thoughtseize.
4 Thoughtseizes, 3 Duress, 3 Sin Collector post board. That's a lot.
That is hard to get through. Over on this game, a turn 2 Scavenging Ooze is hit by a Doomblade from Gerard Fabiano, and the first permanent to stick on his side is this Ashiok Nightmare Weaver that goes up to 5, exiling a pair of Golgari Charms and an Elvish Mystic.
Now, those are the only Golgari Charms in Chris's list. He only has those 2 copies. So that's a big deal insofar as Gerard now knows that his Supreme Verdicts are good to go. There's not going to be any regeneration to be had. Yeah,
knowing exact numbers can be so helpful here, and that's why VanMeter also interested in keeping the board clear, just as Gerard is. He goes ahead and Abrupt Decays this Ashiok before Gerard gets another chance to mill with it.
So with an Abrupt Decay cast and 2 Golgari Charms having been milled over here, Gerard's Detention Spheres are going to be much more stable going forward than they normally would be in this matchup.
Yeah. So neither player really able to stick a threat here. Gerard with his 4th land just as a Temple of Silence tapped. But this game, you know, when both players just trade threats for removal, has got to favor Fabiano.
Yeah, playing the game this way is setting the pace for a Sphinx's Revelation.
Yeah. VanMeter into... There's Dissolve mana open, but he goes ahead and casts Xenagos into the mana, is rewarded for it for taking that risk, and Satyr token is made, and once again, it's Xenagos dealing the first points of damage to Gerard Fabiano.
Yeah, Chris has both Stormbreath Dragon and Rakdos Return in his hand, so even though it was risky there for him to cast it, he's setting the stage for some more powerful cards.
Yeah, Detention Sphere takes out Xenagos, leaving just a Satyr behind. Gerard still hits land drops. He hits land 5 and has 2 mana up, possibly representing a negate here or a pinpoint removal spell.
And having access to Doomblade and Ultimate Price helps out Gerard a lot in this matchup because it gives him access to good answers to Mistcutter Hydra, which you see right now. A lot of Esper blue-white control decks really struggle with this card, but Gerard's list can shove it aside pretty easily.
Yeah, and a Mistcutter for 3 is made by VanMeter, puts Fabiano down to 13. And here we see this is the game plan for Jund Monsters in the matchup. His hand is just so threat dense with good cards here. It has, you look at his hand, it had Mistcutter Hydra, Rakdos' Return, Supreme Verdict, Gorklan Rampager, Rakdos' Return, Stormbreath Dragon. Like, these all are must-answer cards.
Another very important angle of attack that Chris has right now is that Mutavault in play too. Don't overlook that. There's going to be spots where Gerard has a lot of mana up, and instead of casting spells into potential counter spells, he can keep the pressure going with Mutavault.
Yeah. VanMeter does hit his 5th land. This is a Temple. He scries a card to the bottom with it. Gerard did not hit land number 6, so he's also stuck on 5 right now. He was able to Supreme Verdict the board away, so right now he's just taking damage off that Mutavault you mentioned. But VanMeter continues to press a bit of an assault here. He makes Scavenging Ooze post-combat, and his hand still with 3 Haymakers in it.
And that's going to be the problem here. Gerard's probably going to have to start tapping out, or at least tapping low, to answer the threats that Chris is generating, and that opens the door for things like Stormbreath Dragon and especially Rakdos Return to end the game.
Yeah, and it's that great pressure that Jund Monsters can have. You see there's a negate in Fabiano's hand. It's at the ready for a Rakdos' Return, but the question is whether or not he can afford to leave up negate while answering cards like the Scavenging Ooze, the Stormbreath Dragon in VanMeter's hand, or the Mistcutter Hydra that VanMeter drew for the turn.
And Mistcutter is another great draw here. It just gives Chris another angle of attack on turns where he suspects that Gerard is representing counter spells and not something else.
Yeah, he can really punish Gerard for leaving this mana up. So we'll see here. I'm guessing he's going to try for one of the haste creatures. Whether it's Mistcutter or Stormbreath Dragon will be pretty interesting here. My guess is he will go for Mistcutter Hydra.
With Gerard potentially having Dissolve at the ready here, it seems like a good spot to resolve Mistcutter.
Yeah, he resolves Mistcutter. Now if Gerard, say, plays a Supreme Verdict, then he can go ahead and follow up with Stormbreath Dragon.
Correct.
And yeah, Mistcutter for 4 is joined by Scavenging Ooze. They swing for 6, and Fabiano is down to 5. He's going to be forced to have an answer, not only for the 2 creatures on board, but for that Mutavault that's still hanging out.
Yeah. And it's not just an issue of what's in play right now too. It's answering what's in hand.
Ideally, Gerard would have something like Elspeth Sun's Champion here to deal with that, but VanMeter may even have that covered with Rakdos' Return and Stormbreath Dragon.
And a Gorklan Rampager in hand. I mean, he's got a
wow.
lot of answers.
So it's got to start, I feel like it's got to start then on Supreme Verdict here. And speaking of Supreme Verdict, the play for Gerard, he does not have white mana up. He only has 2 white sources right now, so he has 2 blue-black lands.
So another question, if you're Chris, is do you play around something like Doomblade or Ultimate Price and cast your Rakdos Return, or do you play around Negate and cast the Stormbreath Dragon? Now, Vraska might give him the best of both worlds here, where it's a non-critical threat, it's the least significant card in his hand, but it is something that warrants an answer from Gerard. So he may be able to bleed out a Negate here, further setting the stage for this Rakdos Return.
Because there's that Xenagos under Detention Sphere, Gerard is pretty much locked into negating either the Vraska or the Rakdos' Return. So we'll see how VanMeter chooses to play it. He's going to start by activating Mutavault.
I think he may believe that Gerard just doesn't have a Doomblade. Based on what happened last turn, he didn't Doomblade the Mistcutter Hydra. and Gerard casts a Supreme Verdict. So Chris is sensing some weakness here.
Yeah, but he's going to go ahead and try to go Clan Rampage with that Mutavault. Is it going to be lethal? Gerard looks like he has a Supreme Verdict and Negate, and that'll do it. Chris VanMeter, 2-0, moves on to the finals, 1 match away from that elusive Star City Open victory.
And that was a great play by Chris there. You know, that's not necessarily a play